The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was the largest structure ever built by any living species, and it floated in silence around a dead star called HFY, spinning slowly like a cathedral made of glass and ancient metal. Inside, hundreds of alien delegations filled the curved rows of seats that rose up toward a ceiling so high it vanished into shadow. And every seat was taken, because today was the Tribute Conclave, the annual ceremony where the great powers of the galaxy handed out gifts to the lesser species as a show of dominance and favor. Some called it diplomacy, but everyone knew what it really was. It was a ranking, a public display of who mattered and who did not. Ambassador Elias Varga stood near the back of the hall, wearing a simple dark suit that looked almost ridiculous among the gleaming armor and flowing robes of the alien delegates around him. And he knew exactly where humanity stood in this ranking. Dead last, since first contact. And humanity had managed to colonize 7 small worlds, build a fleet that most species would call embarrassing, and send exactly one representative to the Galactic Council. Him. He was tall for a human, with gray at his temples and calm brown eyes that never seemed to blink when they should, and he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, while the ceremony dragged on, and species far older and far more powerful than his own received their tributes. The Valkyrie Confederacy received mining rights to an asteroid belt worth more than Earth's entire yearly output, and their ambassador bowed so low his long neck nearly touched the floor. The Dreth Collective received a shipment of military-grade plasma cores, and their hive general clicked her mandibles in satisfaction. Even the Pelori, a species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel 2 centuries ago, received a trade agreement that would enrich their worlds for. All of these gifts came from one source, the Zorath hegemony, the oldest and most powerful empire in the known galaxy, ruled by a creature so ancient and so feared that most species did not dare speak his name above a whisper. King Thal Zorath sat on a throne that hovered above the chamber floor, surrounded by his crimson-marked royal guard, and his 4 black eyes watched the proceedings with the bored patience of someone who had been doing this for longer than most civilizations had existed. He was enormous even by Zorath's standards, his scaled body wrapped in ceremonial armor that pulsed with a faint red light, and when he spoke, the translation systems carried his voice to every corner of the hall in a deep rumble that made smaller species flinch. One by one, the gifts were given, and one by one, the lesser species expressed their gratitude with the appropriate amount of groveling. Then it was humanity's turn. The herald, a thin, insect-like creature with a voice like cracking ice, announced the name of the human delegation, and Elias stepped forward into the open floor of the chamber. He could feel every eye in the room turning toward him, and he could feel the familiar weight of their contempt. The hall went quiet, but it was not the respectful quiet that had greeted the other delegations. It was the quiet of anticipation, the kind of silence that comes right before a joke reaches its punchline. King Thal Zorath leaned forward on his throne and let the silence stretch, and then he spoke. To the humans, he said, and there was something in his voice that Elias did not like, a thin edge of amusement barely hidden. We give a gift of great personal significance. A murmur rippled through the chamber. We give to you, the king continued, our youngest daughter, Princess Kalith Zorath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the laughter began. Back rose, a wet gurgling sound from the Pelori, a sharp clicking from the Dreth, and then it spread like fire across dry grass, until the entire grand hall was shaking with it. Hundreds of alien species laughing at once in their own terrible ways. Elias did not move. He understood exactly what was happening, because he had studied the Zorath for years, and he knew their culture better than most humans alive. And he knew that giving a person as a tribute was the deepest insult the hegemony could deliver. It meant that the receiving species was so worthless that they deserved nothing of value, only a living reminder of their own insignificance. And he knew about Calith. Everyone on the council knew about Calith, the defective princess, the one born wrong, with pale violet markings instead of the royal crimson, and a strange sensitivity that the Zorath considered a curse rather than a gift. And she had been quietly erased from the royal lineage years ago. Alive, only because killing a royal, even a defective one, would violate ancient Zorath law. She was nothing to them, and they were giving nothing to the humans. The message could not have been clearer. A side door opened, and Calith was led into the chamber by two Zorath guards who held her arms as though she might try to run, though she showed no sign of resistance. She was smaller than any Zorath Elias had ever seen, barely taller than a human woman, and her scales were a soft violet color that shimmered faintly under the chamber lights, and her golden eyes were fixed on the floor as she walked, and she did not look up, not once, as the laughter continued to crash around her like waves against a stone. The guards released her in the center of the floor and stepped back, and she stood there alone between the human ambassador and the throne of her father, and she looked like she was waiting to disappear. Elias watched her for a long moment, watched the way her hands trembled at her sides, and he watched the way her jaw tightened every time a new burst of laughter echoed through the hall. And he watched the way she kept her eyes down, as though looking up might shatter something inside her that was already cracked beyond repair. And something in his chest, something old and stubborn and deeply, immovably human, refused to let this stand. He stepped forward. The laughter began to fade, not because of any command, but because the delegates were curious now, eager to see how the human would react to his humiliation. Elias stopped in front of Calith, and did something that no one in that chamber expected. He bowed. Not a shallow nod, not a dismissive gesture, but a full and formal bow, the kind reserved in human diplomacy for visiting heads of state. Deep, and slow and deliberate, and he held it for 3 full seconds before rising again. The hall went absolutely silent. "Highness," Elias said, and his voice was steady and warm, and carried to every corner of that enormous room without any need for amplification. "On behalf of Earth and all her colonies, I accept, not a gift, but a guest, and she will be treated with every dignity we possess." Calith looked up. Her golden eyes were wide and wet, and they locked onto his face with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. Not gratitude, not yet, but something even more fragile. Surprise, pure, trembling, disbelieving surprise, because no one in her entire existence had ever spoken to her like she mattered. The silence in the hall was total now, and it was a different kind of silence than before, heavier, more uncertain, and some of the delegates shifted in their seats, as though something had changed in the air that they could not quite name. King Thal Zorath stared down at the human from his throne, and the amusement was gone from his black eyes, replaced by something colder. He had meant to humiliate this species. He had meant to remind the galaxy that humans were nothing. But the human had not played the role he was supposed to play, and now the king was left with the uncomfortable sensation that somehow, in some way he could not yet identify, he had made a mistake. Elias extended his hand to Calith, palm open, fingers steady, and she stared at it as though she had never seen such a gesture before. "Shall we go?" he asked quietly. She reached out and took his hand, and her fingers were cool and trembling against his skin. They walked out of the grand hall together, and behind them the silence held for a long time before it finally broke into confused and uneasy whispers that spread through the delegations like smoke. On his throne, King Thal Zorath watched them leave, and told himself that none of this mattered, that the human and his broken daughter were both beneath his concern. Kalith had expected a cage. She had spent the entire journey from the Galactic Council to the human homeworld, preparing herself for the reality of what awaited her. A cold room, a locked door, perhaps a laboratory where they would study her the way scientists study captured animals, poking and prodding and writing notes about the defective Zorath specimen. That was what any sensible species would do with a political hostage who had no value. Instead, when the human transport ship entered orbit around Earth, and she looked out the observation window, a woman with dark skin and kind eyes was waiting for her at the landing platform with a warm drink and a smile. "My name is Dr. Lena Okafor," the woman said, "and I am here to help you with whatever you need." Kalith stared at her and said nothing, because she had learned a long time ago that silence was safer than words. They took her to a residence in a city called Geneva, and it was not a cell or a cage, laboratory, but an actual home, with windows that opened to let in the breeze, and soft furniture and a garden outside, where small green plants grew in neat rows, and there were no guards at the door and no locks on the windows. She waited 3 days for the trick to reveal itself. It never did. On the 4th day, Dr. Okafor visited her again, and sat across from her at a small table, and asked her a question that broke something open inside Kalith's chest, like a crack spreading through ice. "What would you like to do?" Kalith blinked. "I do not understand the question," she said. "It is not a complicated question," Lena said gently. "I am asking what you want, what interests you, what you enjoy, what kind of life you would like to build here." Kalith stared at her for a very long time, and then she said in a voice so quiet it was almost not there at all, "No one has ever asked me that before." Lena's expression did not change. Something behind her eyes shifted, a flash of something fierce and sad at the same time, and she reached across the table and placed her hand over Kalith's cool, trembling fingers. "Then it is long overdue," she said. In the weeks that followed, Kalith began to explore the world she had been given to, and everything she found confused her. Human cities were loud and chaotic, and full of people who seemed to feel everything at maximum volume. Joy, anger, grief, love, all of it pouring out of them in great uncontrolled waves that crashed against Kalith's empathic senses like a storm against a coastline. Among the Zorath, emotions were suppressed, controlled, hidden behind walls of discipline and protocol, and the emotional landscape of the hegemony was a flat gray plain where nothing moved and nothing grew. But here on Earth, emotions were everywhere, bright and wild and overwhelming, and at first Kalith could barely stand it, retreating to her residence with headaches that lasted for hours, pressing her hands against her temples, and wondering if this planet would drive her mad before anything else could. But slowly, gradually, she began to notice something. The emotions were not just loud, they were warm. There was a texture to human feeling that she had never encountered in any other species, a depth and richness that went beyond simple happiness or simple anger. And even their sadness had a quality to it that she could only describe as beautiful, layered and complex, and somehow hopeful, as though humans had learned to carry their grief without letting it crush them. She started reading human history, and what she found horrified her. Wars that killed millions, cruelties that defied comprehension, entire civilizations built on suffering and exploitation. And she almost stopped reading because she thought she had finally found the darkness beneath the bright surface. But then she found something else. She found that after every atrocity, humans had built something new, laws and institutions and entire movements dedicated to the idea that what happened must never happen again. And she read about people who had given their lives to protect strangers, and she read about a concept called human rights that declared every single person had value simply because they existed. And she read about orphanages, and adoption, and refugee programs, and disability rights. Systems built specifically to catch the people who fell and lift them back up. No other species in the galaxy had anything like this. The Zorath discarded their weak. The Dreth consumed their unproductive. The Velkari simply pretended their unwanted did not exist. But humans, these small and fragile and impossibly emotional creatures, had decided thousands of years ago that the measure of their civilization was how they treated the ones nobody wanted. Kalith read about this for 3 days, straight, without sleeping, and when she finally closed the last file, she sat in the dark of her residence and held her own hands and tried to understand what it meant that she had been thrown away by the most powerful empire in the galaxy, and caught by the one species that had built its entire identity around catching people. Dr. Okafor became her anchor in those early months, patient and steady, and never once treating Kalith as a project or a curiosity, but as a person who was healing from wounds that went deeper than skin. They talked for hours, and Lena explained things about human culture that no database could capture. Why humans sang when they were sad, why they held each other when they were afraid, why they laughed at things that were not funny, because sometimes laughter was the only wall between a person and despair. "You feel things very deeply," Lena told her one afternoon. "And among your people, that was treated as a flaw. But here, it is not a flaw. Here it is, a gift. And I think you are only beginning to understand how powerful that gift truly is." Kalith was not sure she believed that yet, but she wanted to. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the story of the human and the unwanted princess had become a joke that would not die, shared across communication networks and diplomatic channels, used as evidence of humanity's irrelevance, a punchline that reinforced what everyone already believed about the youngest species on the galactic stage. Nobody important paid attention to what was actually happening on Earth, because nobody important thought anything important could happen there. They were wrong. Months passed, and Kalith grew stronger in ways that even she did not fully understand, her empathic abilities sharpening and expanding as she lived among a species that wore its emotions on the outside instead of locking them away. And she began to sense things she had never been able to sense before. Not just feelings, but intentions. Not just emotions, but the truths hidden beneath them. She could sit in a room with 10 humans and know within seconds who was lying, who was afraid, who was hiding something, and who genuinely meant every word they said. It was not magic, and it was not technology. It was simply what happened when an empathic mind that had been starved its entire life was suddenly surrounded by the richest emotional environment in the known galaxy. One evening, Kalith sat in the garden of her residence on the colony world of Avalon 3, where she had been moved at her own request because she said the sunsets there reminded her of something she could not name. And she listened to the sound of human children playing in a park beyond the garden wall. Their joy hit her like sunlight, pure and bright and completely unguarded, and she felt tears running down her face before she even realized she was crying. Dr. Okafor found her there and sat beside her without speaking, because Lena had learned that sometimes the best thing a human could do was simply be present. "They feel so much," Kalith whispered, "and they are not ashamed of it." Lena put a hand on her shoulder and held it there. "No," she said, "we are not." Kalith closed her golden eyes and let the warmth of human emotion wash over her, the laughter of children, the quiet love of the woman beside her, the distant hum of a civilization that had decided long ago that no one was worthless. And for the first time in her life, she understood why the Zorath had feared what she was. It was not because she was weak. 3 years changed everything, though the galaxy did not notice until it was far too late. Kalith, was no longer the trembling, silent girl who had been marched into the grand hall of the Galactic Council like a piece of unwanted furniture. She had grown into something that the Zorath hegemony had never imagined possible, something that no species in the known galaxy had ever seen before, because no species had ever thought to nurture what the Zorath had thrown away. She stood taller now, not in height, but in presence, and her pale violet scales seemed to catch the light differently than they had before, brighter, sharper, as though the change inside her had worked its way outward and rewritten even the way she moved through a room. She spoke 7 human languages fluently and had studied the diplomatic traditions of 43 galactic species, and she could walk into a negotiation chamber and read the emotional state of every person in it before the first word. But it was the work she did in secret that changed the course of human history. Earth's Intelligence Directorate, the EID, had recruited her quietly 18 months after her arrival, not with threats or manipulation, but with a simple, honest offer. And she had accepted because she understood by then what the humans had done for her, and she wanted to give something back. Her handler was a calm, sharp-eyed man named Director Samir Hadid, who had spent 30 years in intelligence work and had never encountered an asset like Kalith. Not because of her alien nature, but because of what she could do. "You are asking me to use my ability as a weapon," she had said during their first meeting. "No," Hadid had replied, "I am asking you to use it as a shield. There are species out there that want to hurt us, and we cannot fight them with ships or soldiers, but we can outthink them if we know what they are really thinking." Emotions as he spoke, tasting the texture of his sincerity, probing for deception, searching for the hidden motives that she had learned to expect from every powerful person she had ever met. She found none. He meant every word, and beneath the calm exterior, she felt something that surprised her. Fear, not of her but for his species, a deep and desperate worry that humanity was running out of time in a galaxy that did not care whether they survived. So she agreed, and the EID gave her a codename that only a handful of people in the entire human government would ever know. They called her the Empress of Whispers. The results were immediate and devastating, not in the way of bombs or battles, but in the quiet, invisible way that truly dangerous things happen. Humanity's diplomatic position had been crumbling for years, squeezed between larger powers that saw Earth and its colonies as easy targets for exploitation. Straightforward were poisoned by backroom agreements that humans could never detect, and alliances that seemed promising collapsed at the last moment due to hidden pressures from species that smiled to humanity's face and plotted behind their backs. All of that changed when Kalith began sitting in the room. She never appeared at the negotiation table herself, that would have been too obvious, but she was always nearby, sometimes in an adjacent room, sometimes watching through a secure video feed, and she fed her readings directly to Ambassador Elias Varga through a tiny earpiece that no scanner could detect, because it was built from human technology that the galaxy had never bothered to study. Elias had always been a skilled diplomat, but with Kalith whispering in his ear, he became something else entirely, something that the galactic community had no framework to understand. He knew when delegates were bluffing before they finished their sentences, when offers were genuine and when they were traps, and he knew exactly which members of a coalition were loyal and which ones could be turned with the right words at the right moment. At a trade summit on the neutral station of Ferrix 12, the Valkyrie Confederacy attempted to organize a 5-species embargo against humanity's colony worlds, a move that would have strangled human expansion for decades and left Earth isolated and vulnerable. The Valkyrie ambassador, a tall and elegant creature named Sothal, who is considered one of the finest diplomatic minds in the galaxy, spent weeks assembling his coalition in secret, trading favors and making promises, and carefully constructing a united front that he believed was unbreakable. The closed-door summit lasted 6 hours. By the end of the first hour, Elias had identified the two weakest members of the coalition, because Caliph had felt their doubt the moment they entered the room, a faint, bitter taste of uncertainty beneath their polished confidence. By the end of the third hour, he had offered those two delegates a counter-proposal so precisely tailored to their hidden desires that they could not refuse without revealing to their allies that they had been lying about their own priorities. By the end of the fifth hour, a third member of the coalition had switched sides entirely after Elias casually mentioned a piece of information that the delegate had believed was secret. Not because the EID had spied on him, but because Caliph had felt the shape of his guilt when certain topics were raised, and Elias had made an educated guess that landed like a surgical strike. Ambassador Sothal watched his carefully built coalition collapse in real time, and could not understand what was happening, because everything the human did should have been impossible. No species was this good at reading a room. No diplomat was this precise. No intelligence service was this thorough. When the summit ended, Sothal walked past Elias in the corridor and stopped, and his large silver eyes studied the human's face with an expression that was equal parts respect and suspicion. "How?" he asked simply. Elias smiled, a warm, genuine, completely unhelpful smile, and said, "Humans are very good listeners." The story spread, as such stories always do, and within months the entire diplomatic community was buzzing with confused speculation about how the humans kept winning. Some species theorized that Earth had developed a new type of surveillance technology, and others believed the humans had somehow cracked the encryption on the galactic communication networks, and a few even suggested that humanity had made a secret alliance with one of the elder species, though no one could agree on which one. Nobody suspected the truth, because the truth was too absurd. The idea that the defective Zorath princess, the one the entire galaxy had laughed at, was the secret engine behind humanity's impossible rise, was so far beyond what anyone would consider, that it never even appeared as a theory. Ambassador Elias Varga was elevated to High Ambassador, the first human to hold that rank, and the galactic community began to adjust its assessment of humanity in small but significant ways. Trade offers improved, military threats decreased, and for the first time in 40 years, other species began to treat humans as something other than a joke. But Caliph knew it would not last, not because the galaxy was unkind, but because someone would eventually figure out the truth, and when they did, everything would change. She was right. The Zorath hegemony had intelligence operatives embedded in every major galactic institution, and one of them, a cold and meticulous officer named Keth Vorenthal, had been assigned to study humanity's sudden diplomatic success and determine its source. Analyzing recordings of every negotiation the humans had won, studying the timing of Elias's responses, mapping the patterns of his impossible insights, and slowly eliminating every possible explanation until only one remained. It was not technology, and it was not espionage, and it was not an alliance with an elder species. It was a person. Keth reviewed the footage of the summit on Ferrix 12 one more time, slowing it frame by frame, and in a reflection on the polished wall behind the human delegation, he saw something that made his blood go cold. A faint shape, barely visible, standing just beyond the edge of the camera's view. Pale violet markings, unmistakable against the dark of the observation room. He enhanced the image and stared at it for a long time, and then he opened an encrypted channel to the Zorath throne world, the most secure communication line in the hegemony, and sent a message directly to King Thal Zorath. The message was 3 sentences long. P. The source of humanity's advantage has been identified. It is Princess Caliph. She is not broken, and she never was, and what they have made of her is something we should have feared from the beginning. On the throne world of Keth Prime, the king read the message twice. Then he read it a third time, and for the first time in centuries, the most powerful ruler in the galaxy felt something he had almost forgotten existed. King Thal-Zorath had not visited the deep archives of the hegemony in over 300 years. But on the night he received Keth Vorenthal's message, he descended alone into the vaults beneath his palace, past the guards who bowed, and the scholars who scrambled to open doors, until he stood in a chamber so old that the walls themselves seemed to breathe with the weight of forgotten history. He pulled a record from the archive that had not been accessed in over 2,000 years, and he read it standing in the cold blue light of the vault. And with every line he read, the fear in his spine grew deeper. The record described the Soul Readers, a bloodline of Zorath empaths so powerful that they could perceive not just the surface emotions of those around them, but the deepest layers of intention, loyalty, deception, and hidden truth that lay beneath. The ancient Zorath had revered them, and for centuries the Soul Readers had served as advisors to the throne. Abilities making the early hegemony almost impossible to outmaneuver in diplomacy or war. But the Soul Readers were also dangerous, because they could not be lied to, and a kingdom that cannot lie to its own advisors is a kingdom that must face the truth about itself, its crimes, its corruptions, its secret shames. And the Zorath ruling class had eventually decided that truth was a luxury they could not afford. So, they had systematically purged the Soul Reader bloodline from the royal family, not through execution, which would have been too visible, but through selective breeding and quiet exile and the slow, deliberate reclassification of empathic sensitivity as a genetic defect. And they had succeeded, or so they believed, until a child was born with pale violet markings and golden eyes, who felt too much and saw too clearly. A child they named Caliph, and then tried very hard to forget. The king closed the archive and stood in the darkness and understood at last. What he had done, he had not discarded a defective daughter. He had handed the most dangerous weapon in Zorath history to the one species in the galaxy reckless enough to sharpen it. Within days, the Zorath diplomatic machine, the largest and most sophisticated in the galaxy, swung into action, and the demand was delivered to Earth through official channels with the full weight of the hegemony behind it. The message was framed in the language of diplomacy, but its meaning was simple. King Thal-Zorath wanted his daughter back. The official communication described it as a correction of a diplomatic misunderstanding, and expressed the king's deep regret at the inadvertent separation of Princess Caliph from her family, and it offered humanity a package of concessions so generous that it made several intelligence analysts at the EID physically sit down when they read it. 3 colony worlds in resource-rich systems, full access to Zorath military. Technology 2 generations ahead of anything humans possessed, and a permanent trade agreement that would have catapulted humanity's economy forward by decades. The price was one person. Director Hadid brought the offer to Caliph personally, because he believed she had the right to know what was happening, and he sat across from her in the quiet room where she worked, and placed the document on the table between them. She read it without expression, and when she finished, she looked up at him and said, "He is afraid of me." "Yes," Hadid said. "He should be," she said, and there was no anger in her voice, just a simple statement of fact, spoken by someone who had finally understood her own worth. The United Earth Council debated the offer for less than 1 day. Some voices argued for acceptance. The concessions were extraordinary, and the strategic advantage was undeniable, and the cold mathematics of politics suggested that one person, however valuable, could not possibly be worth more than what was being offered. But High Ambassador Elias Varga stood before the council and spoke in the same steady, warm voice that had echoed through the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council 3 years earlier, and he said something that ended the debate permanently. "If we give her back," he said, "we tell the galaxy that humans have a price, that our principles are for sale, and our protection is conditional, and our word means nothing. And if we do that, then everything we have built and everything we claim to stand for becomes a lie. And I will not be the man who sells a member of our family to prove that we are just like everyone else." The council voted unanimously to refuse. The official response was brief and polite and immovable. Kalith was a citizen of Earth by her own choice and under the protection of the United Earth government, and no offer, however generous, would change that. Fascination and disbelief, because no minor species had ever refused the Zorath hegemony anything, and the idea that humans would turn down such wealth for the sake of a single person was so foreign to the galactic understanding of power that most diplomats simply could not process it. Elias Varga was called to address the full Galactic Council to explain humanity's position, and he walked into the same grand hall where this story had begun, the same curved rows of seats, the same alien faces, the same hovering throne where King Thal Zorath sat with his 4 black eyes, burning with barely contained fury. And Elias delivered a speech that would be studied in diplomatic academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. 3 years ago, he said, you gave us a young woman and told us she was worthless, and you laughed because you believed you were humiliating us. And perhaps you were right. Perhaps by your standards it was an insult, because by your standards, person's value is measured by their power and their bloodline and their usefulness to the state. He paused, and the silence in the hall was absolute. But we do not share your standards, he continued, and we never have, because where we come from, the measure of a civilization is not how it treats its strongest members, but how it treats its most vulnerable. And by that measure, this council has failed in ways that I lack the time to describe. He looked directly at the king. You want her back because you have finally realized what she is worth. But you did not see that worth when she stood before you, small and frightened and alone. And you do not get to claim value that you were too blind to recognize. His voice hardened, but only slightly. Kalith Zorath is not your subject. She has not been your subject since the moment you discarded her. And she is not our weapon. She is our friend, our citizen, and our family. And humanity does not sell its family. Not for territory, not for technology, and not for all the stars in your hegemony. The silence after his speech lasted 11 seconds, an eternity in the grand hall. And when it broke, it was not with laughter, but with something the chamber had never heard before in response to a human. Murmured voices of respect, quiet and uncertain, but unmistakable. King Thal Zorath did not speak for a long time, and when he finally did, his voice was low and dangerous. You will regret this decision, he said. Elias met his gaze without flinching. Perhaps, he said, but at least we will be able to live with ourselves. Within hours, Zorath fleet movements were detected near humanity's border colonies. Not an invasion force, not yet, but a clear message that the hegemony's patience was not infinite. The galaxy held its breath, and Kalith, watching the crisis unfold from a secure facility on Avalon 3, made a decision that she had been preparing for since the day she first understood what the humans had given her. She contacted High Ambassador Varga and told him that she wished to address the Galactic Council herself, not as a human asset and not as the Empress of Whispers, but as Princess Kalith Zorath, invoking an ancient Zorath law so old that even the king could not override it. It was called the Right of the Discarded, a legal provision from the earliest days of the hegemony that allowed any member of the royal family who had been formally disowned to speak before any governing body that had granted them refuge. And the law existed because the ancient Zorath had understood that discarding a person did not erase their voice. The Galactic Council reviewed the request and confirmed its validity, and the session was scheduled for the following day, the largest audience in the history of the Grand Hall, broadcast to every inhabited world in the galaxy. Kalith stood in her quarters that night and looked at herself in the mirror. Her pale violet scales, her golden eyes, the face of a woman who had been born into the most powerful empire in existence, and thrown away like waste, and rebuilt by the kindest species she had ever known. Tomorrow she would walk back into the room where she had been given away, and she would speak, and the galaxy would listen. She was The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council had never been this full. Every seat was taken, and delegates who had arrived too late stood in the aisles and pressed against the walls. And beyond the chamber itself, the broadcast systems carried the feed to trillions of viewers across thousands of worlds. The largest audience ever assembled for a single event in the history of the known galaxy. They had come to see the defective princess, the discarded daughter, the joke that had somehow stopped being funny. Caliph walked into the chamber alone. She wore no armor and carried no weapons and had no guards at her side. Just a woman in a simple dark dress that the humans had made for her, cut in a style that honored both Zorath tradition and human elegance, and her pale violet scales caught the light as she moved, and scattered it in soft patterns across the floor. The silence that greeted her was not the mocking silence of 3 years ago. Anticipation, heavy and electric, the kind that comes when an entire galaxy realizes it is about to witness something it cannot take back. She walked to the center of the floor, the exact spot where she had stood as a trembling girl, with her eyes on the ground. And she stopped and lifted her chin and looked out at the assembled delegates of every known species. Then she looked at her father. King Thalzaroth sat on his throne above the chamber, surrounded by his crimson guard, and his 4 black eyes watched her with an expression that shifted between contempt and something he was trying very hard to keep hidden. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, and then she turned to face the council and began to speak. "I stand before you today under the right of the discarded," she said, and her voice was clear and steady and carried to every corner of the hall. "A law that my father's ancestors wrote because they understood something that my father has forgotten, that throwing a person away does not silence them. It only gives them a different stage." She paused, and in that pause she did something that no one in the chamber expected. She opened her empathic abilities fully, not inward, as she had always done, but outward, pushing her own emotions through the hall, like a wave of warm water that touched every mind in the room, regardless of species or biology, or the walls they had built around their hearts. And they felt her. The delegates gasped and shifted in their seats as Caliph's memories washed over them, not as words or images, but as raw emotion, pure and unfiltered, the way she had experienced them. They felt her childhood first. The cold of the Zorath Palace, the vast empty rooms where no one spoke to her, the servants who looked through her as though she were made of glass, the silence of a family that had decided she did not exist before she was old enough to understand why. Loneliness, the terrible, crushing loneliness of a child who could feel every emotion around her and found nothing but indifference and disgust. A Velkari diplomat pressed his hand against his chest as though something inside it had cracked. They felt the day she was given away, the walk through the grand hall, the laughter that crashed against her from every direction, the guards gripping her arms, her father's voice announcing her disposal with the same tone he might use to describe the removal of a stain, and the absolute certainty in her heart that she would never matter to anyone. A Dreth admiral who had fought in 17 wars and never flinched covered his face with 2 of his 4 hands. Then Caliph shifted the current, and the cold gave way to warmth. They felt the moment a human man bowed to her, the shock of it, the disbelief, the first tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart, and they felt his hand reaching out, palm open, steady, and patient, asking nothing and offering everything. They felt Dr. Lena Okafor, sitting beside her in a garden, saying nothing, just being there. The simple revolutionary act of presence, of someone choosing to be near her, not because they wanted something, but because they cared. They felt the first time she laughed on Earth, a sound that surprised her so much she stopped and pressed her hand over her mouth, because she had not known she was capable of it. They felt the children playing on Avalon 3, their joy hitting her like sunlight, pure and unguarded, and so bright it made her weep. And they felt the slow, agonizing, beautiful process of a broken person learning piece by piece that she was not broken at all, that the thing everyone had called her weakness was in fact the deepest kind of strength. By now, half the chamber was in tears. Hardened warlords who had ordered the destruction of entire worlds sat with wet eyes and trembling hands, who prided themselves on emotional control, gripped the arms of their chairs until their knuckles went pale, and even the translators, the mechanical systems that converted language across species, seemed to strain under the weight of what was passing through the room. Caliph let the wave recede slowly, gently, like a tide pulling back from a shore. And when it was gone, the silence in the hall was the deepest silence that ancient chamber had ever known. She turned to face her father. "You threw me away because I could feel," she said, and her voice did not tremble. "And the humans kept me because they could feel too. That is not weakness, Father. That is the thing your empire has always lacked, and it is the thing that will outlast it." Thalzorath said nothing, but his claws had dug grooves into the arms of his throne. Caliph turned back to the council. "I did not come here today to ask for revenge," she said, "and I did not come here to declare war, or to threaten, or to bargain. I came here to tell you the truth, because the truth is the one thing that my father's empire cannot survive." And then, calmly and methodically, she began to speak. She described the hidden atrocities of the Zorath hegemony, not from intelligence reports or stolen documents, but from what she had personally felt in the emotions of Zorath delegates over 3 years of sitting in rooms with them, reading the guilt and fear and shame that they carried beneath their polished exteriors. She described the suppression of a vassal rebellion on the world of Dren 4, where the Zorath had deployed a biological weapon that sterilized the entire population, rather than risk a prolonged conflict. A war crime that had been erased from every official record. She described the secret weapons program on the moon of Keck 7, where the hegemony was developing planet-killing technology in direct violation of the Galactic Compact, existed as a constant background radiation of terror in the minds of every Zorath military officer she had ever been near. She described the systematic economic exploitation of 12 species who believed they were willing trade partners, but were in fact being slowly drained of resources through agreements designed to create dependency and eventual collapse. Each revelation landed like a hammer blow, and with each one, the chamber erupted in louder and more furious voices, and delegates turned to stare at the Zorath delegation with expressions that ranged from horror to rage. King Thal Zorath rose from his throne. "This is lies," he roared, and his voice shook the translation systems. "The ravings of a defective child who was corrupted by a primitive species. None of this is true, and I will not sit here while—" "You are afraid," Caliph said quietly, and her words cut through his fury like a blade through silk. "I can feel it. Every person in this room can. Feel it now, because I showed them how. Your fear is so loud that it drowns out everything else. And fear like that does not come from a person hearing lies, Father. It comes from a person hearing the truth spoken aloud for the first time." The king fell silent. The chamber erupted. Within minutes, the Velkari Confederacy formally suspended its alliance with the hegemony, and the Dreth Collective demanded an independent investigation into the Dren 4 allegations, and 6 more species announced the immediate review of all trade agreements with the Zorath. Thal Zorath, watching his political empire crack in real time, turned his fury toward the only target he had left. "The hegemony will not forget this," he said, and his voice was cold now, controlled, stripped of pretense, "and the humans will answer for what they have done." But before the threat could settle over the chamber, something happened that changed the calculation entirely. Velkari ambassadors stood. "If the hegemony moves against humanity," so Thal said, and his silver eyes were bright with a fury that had nothing to do with politics, "the Confederacy will stand with Earth." A moment of stunned silence, and then the Dreth Hive General rose on her four legs. "The collective stands with Earth," she said. Then the Pelori, then the Fenari, then the Kesoth, one after another, species rising from their seats and declaring their alignment with the small, fragile, impossibly stubborn species that had taken in a broken girl and made her into the most powerful voice in the galaxy. 26 species stood with humanity before the king could speak again. Not because humans had the strongest fleet, or the most advanced technology, or the largest territory, but because a single human had bowed to a girl no one wanted, and a single civilization had decided that she mattered, and that one act of simple Southern decency had rippled outward until it shook the foundations of the most powerful empire in existence. Thal Zorath looked at the chamber, at the broken alliances, the furious delegates, the daughter he had discarded standing in the center of it all, like a flame that he himself had lit. And he understood at last that he had lost. Not a battle, and not a war, something worse. He had lost the story, the narrative that the Zorath were untouchable, that power was the only currency that mattered, that the weak existed to serve the strong. And he had lost it to a species that should have been too small and too young and too soft to matter. The Zorath delegation withdrew from the chamber in silence, and the fleet near humanity's borders pulled back within the hour. And the greatest empire in the galaxy began its long, slow decline, not with a war, but with a truth spoken by the one person they had been certain could never hurt them. 5 years later, Kaleth Zorath served as humanity's first galactic consul, a position created specifically for her, a bridge between the species that had thrown her away and the one that had caught her. Humanity was no longer a joke on the galactic stage. They were known by a name that had spread across every inhabited world, in every language spoken by every species that had heard the story. They called them the Keepers, the species that took in the broken, the discarded, the unwanted, and made them extraordinary. And they were right to fear that, because a civilization that finds value in what others throw away is not just kind, it is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, because it means that nothing is ever truly wasted, and no one is ever truly lost, and every cruelty committed by every empire will eventually return to face them in a form they never expected. Kaleth stood on the observation deck of humanity's newest diplomatic station and watched the stars, and behind her a door opened. A small voice spoke. "Are you the lady who was thrown away?" She turned and saw a child, a four-armed Dreth girl with clouded, sightless eyes, recently arrived from a hive that had declared her unproductive and cast her out, another unwanted soul, delivered to the only species in the galaxy that would take her in. Kaleth knelt before her and smiled. "I am," she said. "My name is Kaleth, and I was unwanted once too. Would you like to know what the humans taught me?" The child tilted her head. "What?" she asked. Kaleth took the girl's small hands in hers, two of them, gently, the way Lena had once held hers, and said that the ones they throw away are the ones who change the galaxy. The child smiled, and Kaleth felt her emotions bloom like a flower opening in sunlight, fragile and tentative and so full of hope that it nearly broke her heart. Behind them, through the windows of the station, the galaxy turned slowly in the dark. Vast and cold and ancient